The biotic causes, and these are living things, and those are the insects, the diseases, animals, the rodents and whatnot, moles, voles, things that may cause damage. And then the abiotic things that can cause plant problems, and those are the non-living things. So they might be mechanical, where you leave some type of pruning tie wrapped on the plant and it girdles it, environmental, and then chemical, or like a pesticide drift. So knowledge itself is a tool, and that's what we try to do with Extension Master Gardener training, is increase your knowledge about some of these common plant problems we have. It's very helpful to know the time of year specific diseases and insects occur, because there's certain, probably the best one I can think of is in May. I will frequently have people calling and saying, my lawn is brown, I must have grubs. Rarely, it is extremely rare to ever see damage from white grubs to a lawn in May. So that is automatically a red flag for me that there must be something else going on here because of the time of the year. So, it's very helpful to know, what do we typically see at certain times of the year? What are the symptoms and signs to look for? And when do they tend to appear? Recent and past weather patterns. It's a good idea to keep, we all know that. We live in Nebraska, we keep track of the weather. So has it been wet? Was it a wet, rainy spring? Then, we're going to see more foliar diseases, like fungal diseases, in a wet, rainy year. Past weather patterns. In 2012, we had a very severe drought. So 3 to 5 years after a severe drought, we begin to see things like verticillium wilt in trees. We might see an increase in borer damage to trees, just our native borers, because during those stress years, plants' resistance lowers, and then they're more likely to become infected or infested with things like verticillium wilt or a borer. But it takes 3 to 5 years, depending on the health of the plant to begin with, before we start seeing those symptoms. So a lot of times, what you're seeing happened, it actually infected the plant 3 or 5 years ago. So being aware of recent as well as past weather patterns, that's part of knowledge being a tool in helping to diagnose plant problems. Knowing the plant location, where it's growing, and the history, how it was cared for. If you have a shade-loving plant growing in a full sun location, that could very likely be the problem. The growing requirements of the plants. It's good to know those as well, again, just to make sure it's not planted in a location where it's suffering just because of the growing conditions and growing site. Questions to ask about the plant, to get at the history of the plant. But some questions to ask about the history of the plant. What is the plant? You might assume that every homeowner does know that, but they don't, or they usually will say, my tree's dying, or my shrub is dying, etc. And then the first thing, of course, to ask is, well, what type of tree do you have? How long has the plant been in the location where it's currently growing? And plant age, plant size, you might think, isn't that the same thing? Plant age, plant size? No, I mean, I've encountered situations where somebody would call and they're talking about their tree, and you ask the plant size, or I've just made the assumption that it's been planted there for a long time because it's a 15-foot tall tree, or let's say an 8-foot tall tree. And I'll say, how long has it been in the location? Well, it was planted this spring. And this is kind of vice versa. It was planted this spring. So I might automatically assume it's 6 foot tall. And then all of a sudden, as we're talking, they say something about it being a 10-foot tall tree. I'm going, oh, wait a minute, when was it, if I ask the plant age. And that might be a plant that was transplanted maybe moved in with a tree spade. And that could be the issue itself. So getting that in, all that information, gathering all that data is important. Describing the growing conditions of the site, the care practices, how have you irrigated, fertilized, does it have mulch, has it been pruned, just some of the care practices. What has been done to or near the plant recently or in the past? This is a question that we might tend to forget until we can't solve the problem. We're like, well, this is weird, or I don't know what's going on. And then I'll remember, have you done anything near to the plant? Have you dug an underground line? Have you put in a new foundation around your home? Something like that. What else? The question, kind of the systematic approach that's recommended in this Diagnosing Plant Problems from Virginia. Obviously, what are the signs or symptoms, especially if somebody's calling you on the phone? What's happening to the plant? Why do you think something's wrong? What are you seeing? Browning, yellowing, spots, chewing. So do you actually see any insects, rots, or spots, as we call it on Backyard Farmer, bugs, rots, and spots? Is there any kind of a pattern to the damage? Is it top down on the plant, which usually indicates a root issue? Is it from the bottom up? Like with tomatoes, that's frequently going to indicate a disease issue, a fungal disease issue. And how is the plant spreading? Is the problem spreading from plant to plant? Is it only affecting that one plant? Is it spreading rapidly? And are different types of plants affected? If there's many different types of plants affected in a landscape, most likely it's not a biotic. It's not a disease or insect. It's more likely to be abiotic, and more likely to be environmental, possibly mechanical. So because most of our diseases and insects are what we refer to as being host specific, so what will infect one type of plant will not infect another type of plant. And this is a concern that we usually hear from clients. They'll call and say, well, if I don't control it on this plant, is it going to kill all the other plants in my landscape or my garden? But luckily, the majority of plants are host specific. So if only one type of plant is affected, then maybe you could lean towards a biotic, like an insect or disease. But if it's many different types, you might want to start asking some questions about, environment, looking at weather conditions, hail, that type of thing. When were the symptoms first noticed? Were they just, and a lot of times this is a tough one, because when they're first noticed, it's usually when the person calls you, even though the symptoms may have been there a while. But it's a good question to ask, because they may have, well, I noticed it a month ago and I've sprayed this and I've sprayed this and I've sprayed this and nothing's helped, so now I'm calling you. So it's still a good question to ask. And I don't know what else. I want to just think a little bit about what other questions would you ask to take this systematic approach. And again, I encourage you to read through that Virginia publication, because I'm just covering a few of the basic ones that they suggest. Okay, have an open mind, because there can be many different causes for one symptom. Brown spots in lawns are a good example. Brown spots, it's kind of like people. You can have a headache, but there's many different causes for headaches. Brown spots in lawns can be caused by a gas spill, the neighbor's dog, your own dog. Maybe the irrigation, automatic irrigation heads are not overlapping. They're overwatering one area and underwatering another area, so it could simply be a drought area. Insects, diseases, numerous things can cause brown spots in lawns. So many different causes for one symptom. The obvious suspect may not be the guilty party. And a couple of examples here: wilt. When a plant wilts, we automatically assume it's dry and we need to water. But plants, there's wet wilt. Plants will wilt if they're getting too much water. So tattered tree leaves, any kind of tattered leaves, people have a tendency to think there must be an insect chewing on them. And they might apply an insecticide. And we just, with pollinator protection, protecting our beneficial insects, we need to find and identify what the cause of the problem is before we're reaching for a control, at least a chemical control method. So tattered tree leaves can be caused by wind tear. They can be caused by a disease where the disease weakened part of the leaf and then the wind came along and knocked that weakened portion out. There can be many different causes for tattered tree leaves. Not all problems are insects or diseases. As I've been talking about, there's the abiotic. So mechanical, environmental, chemical. There's a lot of lookalikes. So I'm going to show you some lookalikes. And you may not think, you may look at this and think, well, those two insects, they look similar, but they look very different. But stop and think, you don't have them side by side. You don't have a good picture side by side. Somebody has just brought you in one of these as a sample. Now you might look at this and say, ooh, that's long and narrow and it's kind of green. Maybe it's an emerald ash borer. If you didn't have them side by side here. But one is an emerald ash borer and the other one is a honeysuckle flat-headed borer. So we do have things that can look very similar, especially when you're only looking at one of them. If they're side by side, sometimes it's very obvious. But when they're not side by side, it's not as obvious. These look very much alike. These are two different diseases in the lawn, but can you distinguish between them? Not very readily. The one on the left is brown patch. The one on the right is summer patch. So how do you distinguish those? Well, those are things you learn by taking classes like this and just reading the landscape diagnostic book, having some of those tools, visiting with your master extension educator assistant. But with brown patch, excuse me, with brown patch, I call it, you get down on your hands and knees. I call it the hands and knees and nose diagnosis. Get down on your hands and knees and you look very closely at these green grass blades and you will find these lesions. So that's where I was talking about knowledge is a tool and just knowing what signs and symptoms to look for to diagnose the different problems. And most of you know this. So, but with summer patch, this is a root disease. So you actually have to dig up a sample, or the person has to bring in a plug with the soil so you can check out those roots because it infects the roots. You will not find any kind of a lesion on the grass blade. Now, sometimes you can have two things going on at one time, but typically it seems to be more one over the other. Here's some lookalikes. Here's some of those tattered leaves I was talking about earlier. In the upper left, it's oak leaf tatters, which is just kind of a combination of things. We're not 100% sure what causes it. It might be viral. But basically, the leaf was weakened, and then wind came along and kind of tore it out. Sometimes they just grow this way. They kind of become deformed. So we might think there might be some chemical issues here. It's one of those things we're not real sure what causes it. Hackberry tatters, that's another one where you can see the leaves are really young in this picture. We suspect some of it might be that they maybe have gotten herbicide drift early in the spring, and as those leaves are unfurling, and then it's weakened tissue, and again that tender growth is blowing around in the wind, and it just tears out parts of those. The bottom left is a sawfly slug, and you can actually see the insect here, but we're not always lucky enough to have the insect present. But that is why we ask the person, are you seeing any insects? Are you seeing any spots? And then the last one is just hail damage on a lilac leaf. So it's easy to jump to, if somebody calls and says, my leaves are full of holes, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that it's an insect, but it may not be. So ask those questions. Lookalikes, here's some lookalikes. You have tomato leaves that are all distorted, curled up. Now on here, they look different, but the description, somebody would call you and say, my tomato leaves look funny. They're a little curled, they're a little rolled. And usually over the phone, the first thing we typically think of is a herbicide drift. And this upper left is herbicide. But on the upper right, it's physiological leaf roll. It's physiological. There's no disease, there's no insect. It's usually certain varieties are more likely to do it. We see it on plants that have been fertilized a lot with nitrogen, and maybe after a hot spell. But it's physiological, it doesn't kill the plant. You might get a little sunburn on your tomatoes if it happens when you have lots of red tomatoes on there. But the plant usually continues to grow and does fine. And if you look at it, the leaves look very normal. They're just rolled up. Whereas the leaves over here, even the stems, do not look normal at all. And then that bottom one is a virus, tobacco mosaic virus. So we really want to, and when people call with my tomato leaves are curled up, look funny, the first question is, are there other things in the garden or the landscape affected? Because if there are other types of plants affected, then more likely it might be a herbicide drift. But if the only thing affected is a tomato, then more likely we're looking at physiological leaf roll or a virus. There's another look-alike, browning on the edges of leaves. Usually we refer to that as a leaf scorch, and it's usually a sign that the tree is not getting water to the leaves fast enough. The leaves are losing water faster than the roots can replace it. So we might think it needs more water. We might think it needs, there's a root issue. And it could be any of those things, but it could also be a trunk issue. So it's really tough to tell sometimes. But the one here, this is physiological leaf scorch. It may be a younger plant that's not quite established yet. That's why we ask that question. How long has it been in its location? How large is it? What is the growing condition? So if you have a large-leaved maple growing on a very windswept site, maybe it was recently transplanted, much more likely to get physiological leaf scorch. And then this one is leaf scorch from verticillium wilt. That's a fungal disease that grows in the water conducting tissue. So the roots may be fine, the leaves may be fine, but the water can't get fast from the roots to the leaves quickly enough because there's a clogging in the xylem and the phloem, or the xylem. But sometimes you can cut open that stem and you'll see some discoloration. And then that helps you to confirm that that's the disease. Okay, positive identification. I'm almost to the point where we get to do some role playing here. I hope you guys have fun with that. But why positive identification? Well, I really don't have to tell you guys that. It's pretty obvious. But successful, it's the only way to have successful, cost-effective control. Or to even just determine if control is even needed. In many cases, we need to change our care practices. We need to change the management. Maybe we need to change the plant. Maybe it's just the wrong plant in the wrong location. And that's what needs to be done. But if it is a disease, or it is an insect, or even animal damage, the only way we're going to have successful, cost-effective control is to know exactly what we're dealing with. And most organisms are not damaging pests. So, we need to positively identify what the cause is before we ever, especially attempt pesticide control. Many problems are due to the environment or incorrect management. So as I said earlier, change the plant completely because it's the wrong plant for the location, or maybe it's just the weather and the plant's just going to have to look tough for a while. Or we need to change our management practice. So you see these eggs on a plant. And you guys can be thinking to yourself, is your first instinct is I'm going to squish those little buggers before they hatch and eat my plant? Or are you thinking, this is interesting, I wonder what it is. I'm going to let it go and see what hatches. And maybe you see these little black critters crawling around your plant. Is your first instinct, I'm going to squish those little buggers before they get bigger and eat my plants? Or do you just enjoy them for a while and see what they grow into? Now this one's a little more interesting. And hey, that's very colorful. And what's it doing to those aphids? Most of you maybe even know what this is already. But again, it's a lady beetle. So it's a beneficial. So we need to positively identify things too, so we can especially protect our pollinators, protect our beneficials, and we're not trying to control those.